lunatics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to the Supporters Exclusives Politics Guys midweek show. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I am joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School, for our ongoing series on the Federalist Papers. Ken, welcome back to the Federalist Papers.
It's great to be back.
This project, we have done a lot of fun projects together, right? We went through the United States Constitution and all of the amendments. But in some ways, this is even more and maybe harder in a way sometimes. There's a lot of research to be done here. And we were talking about this before the show got started. This is one of those ones where, kids, I don't just tell you to do the reading. You better do the reading in advance if you want to. So I think Ken and I both, we've brought the reading today. We've done the research. We're ready to discuss because there's a lot of elements. So we're tackling today Federalist Papers 17, 18, and 19. Now, for those of you who may be, and I know because of on Discord, you sometimes talk about it, may be following along and reading along with us, or you might also be following us on the Substack as well, where you can read even more in-depth research into what we're going to be talking about today. You'll know that 17, 18, and 19 actually take place in a larger series we'd already started where they're basically talking about the same thing. But we have to break this up, right? We couldn't do this whole juncture at one go. So 17, 18, 19 are these what will oftentimes be called these subjects continued. One of the big questions for Hamilton and Madison here in this argument, and we're going to actually see there's a little bit of merging of their ideas in 17, 18, and 19. We'll talk about that. But what they're trying to get at is pretty clear. What do we need to worry most about in a United States? Do we need to worry about an overwhelming amount of power at the level of the national government, or do we need to worry about internal anarchy? And what's trying to be persuaded here in a large sense is that the real issue isn't that the federal government will be too powerful, the national government too powerful. No, the real issue will be anarchy and states breaking apart from one another. And that's the common theme. And it's a response directly to anti-federalists who took the exact opposite to that answer, right? So in that proposal, what's the thing we got to worry about the most? The anti-federalists worried that this proposed constitution, our current constitution, would create a massive, in their words, consolidated national government that would eventually absorb both states and individual liberty. And here in 17, 18, and 19, they're probably Madison, Hamilton are probably mostly referring to Brutus, who he already earlier identified likely as New York Judge Robert Yates, arguing that the proposed constitution would grant the government, quote, absolute and uncontrollable power. They're also referencing here Cato, who argued that a singular legislature would always get divided among itself. And interestingly here, 17, 18, 19 is also probably taking aim at Patrick Henry. A weird kind of footnote here is Patrick Henry was a very anti-Constitution guy. He thought the Constitution was giving up the very liberties that he had been fighting and dying for against the United Kingdom, or I should say Great Britain at that time. And he argued that the Constitution, once again, his central argument was it concentrated too much power at the national level at the expense of individual states. And so that's what we're coming into here. So 17, 18, and 19, they are responding to that. And we're going to start with 17. 17 is Hamilton. So Hamilton's writing again here for us. He's again trying to respond to those anti-federalists. He starts off 17. I'm curious about what your read on this, Ken. He starts off almost kind of laughing at anti-federalists or being kind of laughing, that's a strong of a word. He really kind of poo-poos them because what he starts with is says, look, y'all say that the national government's going to overstep into the states, but why? Why is anybody going to do that? Because the states don't do anything important. Yeah. That's his argument. I mean, it's funny, but it's true, right?
Yeah.
He says, look, these national guys, they're going to be worried about big, ambitious stuff, not this petty little day-to-day, administration of justice at the state level. They're going to care about things like, in his words, commerce, finance, negotiations, and war, not who wins the lawsuit. And that's actually one of his examples. That's kind of a weird way to start for one.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you take that starting here of 17, this kind of dismissing of it all? No, they're not going to care about that. They're only going to care about war, the real stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I would probably say that a little softer. I don't think he's saying that what the states do is unimportant, but I think he's saying it's more important to most people's day-to-day lives. But I think he is saying it's not glorious.
Yes, that's a better way of putting it. I like that. Yeah. There's no glory in what people care about in those day-to-day businesses.
Yeah, when neighbors get in disputes with each other about where the tree branch fell, that's important to those people, that there's a government that can have some dispute resolution of that, but there's no glory in that. The local judge who decides, oh, you've got to pay, one homeowner A has to pay homeowner B $25 because the tree branch fell. He's just saying, yeah, that's important stuff that the local people need to have in their government. But why would anyone in Washington, D.C. want to get in the middle of that? There's just no power, no glory, nothing that an ambitious person really wants. And, I think it's interesting because to some extent, I think his predictions have proved kind of half true and half not true that way, I think. Like, if you think about the increasing number of subject areas that Congress has legislated about over time, and the, increasing role that federal law and federal law enforcement takes in people's lives, today, which has steadily grown over most of the history of the country, it still, even today, is pretty minor compared to state and local government. Like most people, to the extent that they're going to interact with the government at all, other than what they're filing their income taxes, I suppose, or getting a passport, most people are, they're not worried that, when they're driving home from work, that the FBI is going to pull them over. They're mostly worried, like, I better not speed or the local cop's going to pull me over, And most people, if they've been in court over anything, it's far more likely to have been a local, state or local court than a federal court.
For a little bit of data on that front, one of the stats that always surprises students when we encounter this is when you look, and it changes a little bit year to year, but overall, the most recent statistic on this, if you take all the court cases that are occurring, so all of the new cases that are coming up in a particular year, and approximately 98.7 or greater of them are state cases, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's almost no, and so a lot of times when you're teaching, I'm sure you have to talk about the students, everybody wants to take con law, and you go, okay, well, friend, if you take of that teeny sliver of cases that are federal, the number that, it's almost none. They get all the attention, the glory, like as you were putting it a second ago. But if you're going to be a lawyer, the likelihood is all the things that people care about are at that state level. They can, you talk about the branch and it seems a little bit funny. Yeah. But that's precisely what you care about. You care about your neighbor digging into your backyard. You care about what happened to your car in the accident. You care about the person who stole your iPhone while you were at the gym. That's all state.
Yeah, if your house gets broken into, you're going to call the local police department. You're probably not going to call the FBI, right?
Yeah.
No. There has been a lot more federalization of crime than I think what he contemplated. He's actually puts crime in that category of things that state and local governments are going to deal with, and the federal
he would have put it at zero.
Yeah.
He would have put it at zero, so he'd still be shocked. But
he'd be shocked how much federalization of crime there's been, but still, even criminal law is overwhelmingly state and local law, and some areas of the number one biggest area of civil litigation is family law. It's divorce law. It's stuff like that, and the feds are completely not involved in that, right? So divorce and child custody and things like that. So some, I mean, I think his predictions, even though he didn't predict how much federal law there was going to be, I think his essential insight did prove correct, that by and large, the federal government is not going to have any incentive to want to get involved in governing day-to-day relations that occur locally, and that's always going to be what the state and local governments do.
Yeah, and I think you're right there. That's a really good takeaway. Now, as he continues to move through 17, he then kind of flips the script in a little bit, right? He moves from saying, look, taking power from states, quote, would be as troublesome as it would be negatory. In other words, like, it doesn't matter who's going to care there for the splendor of the national government. But he then moves one step further, and he says, look, when he's not using the name Anti-Federalist here, obviously. We've already talked about why that is. But he says, look, the far more likely scenario is that states will tend to want to encroach on the power of the national government. And he points to stronger allegiances to local and state governments. And you were kind of pointing at that one. Basically, that we're going to tend to think of ourselves as an Ohioan or an Oklahoman first because of those, hey, who am I dealing with first is going to be Oklahoma and Ohio and Kentucky or wherever you're at. And as a result, he argues that, look, it's human nature, quote, for its affections are commonly weak in proportion to the distance or diffusiveness of that object, end quote. Or what he's trying to get at here is that the national government's going to be far away, out of sight, out of mind. You're not going to feel American as much as you are going to feel a state. But now here's an area where he might both be right and wrong, right? Maybe that lasted for a while, but it changes over time. What about this kind of shift that the biggest concern should be that the states are going to have an advantage because they're dealing, in his words, with the ordinary criminal and civil justice. So people are going to care about them the most.
Yeah, so I was thinking about these sections. So I think he underpredicted how big the federal government would get. So just like he was thinking federal government has no incentive to pass laws on subjects that have no glory, I think he was also thinking federal government has no incentive to have a large administration that can go out and do a lot of law enforcement. And the federal government's going to have to rely to some extent on state and local governments to help enforce federal law. And so state and local governments have a lot of ability to undermine that. And I think he was probably thinking of things like our current sanctuary city controversy. Now we have a much bigger federal ICE than I think what he was contemplating. But I think, he was contemplating, well, let's say the federal government passes immigration laws, and which federal government has the power to pass. And then in some cities and states, those laws aren't popular. Well, then the bigger danger here is that the city and state governments are going to be able to just, obstruct or under-enforce or interfere with enforcement of those laws because the state and local governments have the personnel and they have the affection of the people, and they're going to be more responsive to what local people actually want. So I think like that kind of thing he was predicting. And he was saying like, that's actually the threat here is that, you'll have these sanctuary cities where the people don't want federal immigration laws enforced, and therefore the state and local governments, which are more responsive to the people, aren't going to do it. And so, I think he saw that as the danger of having too weak of a federal government so he was arguing that the federal government should be able to, be able to effectively enforce federal law, although I think that was all within the context of not actually predicting quite how much federal law there would later get to be.
On an empirical level, it's also, he might be a little bit wrong here about kind of human nature a little bit, because if you look empirically at the United States, we do have this weird, so we point out the fact, and we're right, most cases are going to be at the state level, right? The people you're going to call if your house gets broken into or your local police force. But when you look at actual participation is inverse to that. And so it is very clear if you only have a state election and no federal election, turnout is just monstrously lower. As a matter of fact, if you have a federal election and there's no president, that's a dip in and of itself. And in some states, such as Oklahoma, they do that on purpose. So here in Oklahoma, our gubernatorial race is purposefully not with the presidential race. We can talk about why, but it means that those races tend to have infinitesimally smaller turnout than they would otherwise. So although in a sense, Hamilton might have been right historically, at least contemporaneously, when it comes to participation, he'll end up being wrong, right? Individuals are far more interested to vote for the president, although he wouldn't have been thinking about president, any individual voting for the Electoral College the way that we do it. But even if we grant him that, he would never think, oh, well, everybody want to turn up and vote for their House member and their senator over wanting to vote for their local representative. He would have thought it being the other way around.
Yeah, although I want to put a little context on that because he's not addressing voting and representation here. He is addressing affection. And, we kind of naturally equate affection with voting and representation. But I think one of his underlying assumptions here is that, state and local governments are, fairly democratic, relatively democratic, but that the United States government, that wasn't really even a big part of the design. So even though we do vote for members of the House and we elect them every 2 years, I think the role of the voters there is to kind of be a check against a government, kind of going wrong. But other than the House of Representatives, the framers' Constitution doesn't really reflect voting at all. Not only did they contemplate a fairly active and deliberative electoral college that would elect the president rather than voters, but also for the U.S. Senate, the state legislatures would elect them, not the voters. And of course, the judges are appointed and get life tenure. So I think the U.S. government was being set up. They would consider it a Republican form of government, but they certainly didn't consider it a democracy. And
Absolutely.
I think the only real role that they saw for voters was being a part of the system of checks and balances, that the voters, through voting for people to go to the House of Representatives, could check and balance the government that way. But
A very Montesquieuian idea, effectively, is what they were viewing. Yeah.
So not that the government was supposed to be especially responsive to what the people want, but that the government was supposed to do the right thing. And if the government went down a very wrong track, then the people could be a check and balance against them through House elections. So I think when he talks about affection, I don't think voter participation would have been one of his metrics for that, because I don't think he really cared about it in terms of the federal government.
Well, before we start moving into 18, I'm going to have to pause us right there because that comes to the end of our ad-supported preview. So if you'd like to hear the rest of this conversation with myself and Ken as we get into 18 and 19, or if you'd like to go back and get caught up and get all the way here, starting all the way with an overview of the Federalist Papers, all you'd have to do is head down to the show notes and click on support. Or if you like to be in a web browser, just head to politicsguys.com/support. Or head to patreon.com/politicsguys. There's all different levels of support, but they're going to get you things like ad-free versions of the weekend show, full versions of our series, which includes this Federalist Paper series with myself and Ken, the Ideology series with myself and Justin, and so much more. You can also get access to the Discord. It's just a lot of fun. But to do that, head down to the show notes, become a supporter today, or head to politicsguys.com/support for all the different ways of becoming a supporter. Now, if you'd like to hear the rest of this show or any of our midweek shows, but you're just not right now in that financial position to do it, maybe you're a student, maybe you just had a baby, please reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com so we can work with you so that you can get some emails from us with the midweek shows. No matter what, we would appreciate if you would subscribe, rate, and review the Politics Guys. Algorithms are so important today, and also is sharing the episodes that you learned something from. So if you found something purposeful, unique, and helpful, share that with people on social media and elsewhere. That is a big deal. I finish by mentioning our just incredible executive producers who make the Politics Guys possible. And they are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugit. We'll be back with a full episode this weekend. Hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,